on an event on developing ambitious, investable and implementable NDCs. My name is Chow Feng. I'm the acting head of the Climate Negotiations and Engagement Branch at our Australia's Department of Climate Change and Energy. In a moment, I'm going to pass over to our distinguished panelists to introduce themselves and also just speak a little bit to what their organizations do. But before that, I just want to take a few minutes to introduce what we're doing here today and what this event is about. So as all of you know, next year, countries are going to be lodging their next nationally determined contributions under Paris. And of course, the global stocktake last year tells us that they should be ambitious, economy-wide, include all sectors and gases, and should be aligned with 1.5 degrees. Now, in the past, when countries have looked at their NDCs and developing NDCs, they've often faced this tension between wanting to speed up their decarbonisation to contribute to the global climate challenge, but also to balance that with costs, with potential impacts to their economy that comes from changing the way they do things. But the global landscape has really changed in the last 5-10 years. Things have really changed dramatically and irreversibly. 160 countries have now committed to net zero by mid-century, which is not very far from now. And that's joined by over 1,000 of the world's largest companies. And the idea that ambitious climate action can bring economic benefits is no longer a narrative, no longer a political story, but now it's a central, competitive economic reality for so many countries. The investments that we've seen coming from different countries, from Americas, from the European Union, from major economies like China and Brazil and others, trillions of dollars per year. And of course, Australia's own Future Made in Australia as well. These are just some of the many examples of the enormous flow of investment into clean energy and low emissions technologies. Now, when we discuss with our partners, with businesses and business groups, we're hearing more and more that countries and the private sector are looking at the next NDCs through that lens of how it can help them capture economic opportunities and how the level of ambition and the quality of the policies that they have that underpins it sends the right signals to attract investment and provide certainty for businesses. So today we're honoured to have some panellists representing senior representatives from both government and business groups. And what we're going to be discussing today is both how governments are approaching the development of their next NDCs and the climate policies with a view to attract investment and seize some of those economic opportunities, but also how are businesses and business groups looking at these NDCs, looking at these climate policies with a view to inform their investment and their asset allocation. So before I jump in, I just want to also recognise that we have representatives here from We Mean Business and the Mission 2025 Coalition, who yesterday published an open letter to the G20 leaders on behalf of the coalition of major businesses calling for ambitious NDCs and outcomes on finance. So that's a well-timed for our event today. And hopefully you can speak to some of that as well. But with that brief introduction, I just want to open up and invite our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll ask them to respond to a few questions, but then of course open up the floor for a bit of Q&A from everyone here today. So if I could pass over to Gerhard first, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and just a reminder to turn on your microphones when you're speaking and turn it off when you're not speaking.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for having me. Gerhard Schlaudraff, I'm the head of international climate finance at the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we look at climate finance inside the UNFCCC and also outside the UNFCCC. The question around MDB reforming the international financial architecture, and how to bring the investments to developing countries that we know we need. Thank you.
Hello everyone, Andrew Prugg, so Managing Director of Policy at the We Mean Business Coalition based in Geneva. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. So what we do is essentially the progressive business voice, bringing together international business organizations and major international businesses pushing for more ambitious positions on climate change. So trying to drive that kind of positive engagement voice to show that business sector wants further action, wants more ambitious, better designed policy. And also we then provide guidance to businesses about what it means for them to be corporate climate leaders and to not only be engaging positively with policymakers, but also doing the right thing in their own shop and to be accountable for the commitments that they're making. So we were integral in founding the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is now kind of the go-to standard for corporates wanting to show leadership on climate change and how they take action. And then we try to link up our kind of policy advocacy around these major international moments. So as was referred to with the G20 happening right now, at the late stages of last week, we thought that it would be really worth showing that businesses is here, is following this process, and signaling that these negotiations could do with a boost of a positive signal from the G20 Leaders Summit. So just getting those business voices very quickly together and transmitting this call to the G20, calling for this kind of renewed signal on both ambition and finance. We're also doing quite a lot on engaging with the NDCs, but we'll come on to that a bit later. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. Eric Krypton from CDPQ. For those of you who don't know what CDPQ is, we're one of the largest pension funds in Canada and in the world. And we're quite proud of our record on sustainability. So we have about 450 billion assets under management, and we're quite proud of the fact that about 54 billion of those are certified green assets, and a full 80% of our portfolio, or just around 308 billion of those assets, are certified low carbon or low emission assets. And we've also achieved a 59% reduction of our emissions from our entire portfolio since our very first climate strategy in 2017. As for myself, what do I do at CDPQ? I do two things. One is I'm based in our New York office where I'm responsible for all of our US government and regulatory affairs work. But I also lead CDPQ's work on global thought leadership in the areas of climate and blended finance. Drawing on my previous experience, I spent 15 years as a Canadian civil servant where I was a veteran of climate change negotiations, and spent 7 years at the United Nations mission in New York where I was our lead on sustainability and helped negotiate the Sustainable Development Goals, among other things. And it's always a pleasure to partner with the Australians, so thank you for inviting me here.
Kushla Munro, I'm from DQ, and sorry, I'm just checking. You're off. Okay. A little bit. Okay. So the Deputy Secretary responsible for climate change, which includes all of this great action agenda and pavilion that you're here today in, but also obviously the domestic agenda as well. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that.
Okay, great. Look, thank you for introducing yourselves. Let's jump into some of those questions. And our first question is pitched to our government representatives, to Kushla and Gerhard. Can you share some insights about how your countries are approaching your climate policies and your NDCs and national targets in a way that drives ambition, but also helps catalyze investment? And maybe we'll go the other direction. I could invite you to speak first, Kushla.
Thanks, Chow. And I really should have said thanks to Gerhard, Andrew and Eric for being here. And I think it's a great panel. So thanks for organising and thanks for coming. So just a few insights from me to maybe kick off the answer to this before I hand to Gerhard. But compared the last time it's always fun. The last time that we did our NDCs and in fact target setting in the past in Australia, there was a big focus about, of course, reducing emissions, and you always have to think about the economic costs of that. But it really was about the constraints. And I think the flip side this time round is quite genuinely understanding that the economic growth and the economic opportunities is a core part of what we need to also think about in terms of the net zero transformation. So that's probably like one of the first insights that we take into the development of the NDCs. So of course NDCs have to be ambitious, but they also need to be credible. So that does mean that we are consolidating on all of the policies and measures that are already in place in Australia, which is already driving really significant emissions reductions. Just before I left, I saw the sort of updated projections. They're still doing the final Q&A, but I think it will demonstrate how far we have come, or this government has come, in a relatively short period of time. So there is a consolidation piece, and I do think that that's a really important part about how you're always building upon those policies. But of course, you have to also stretch. And so as part of that stretch, it's really quite considered in terms of the work and advice that we'll get from our Climate Change Authority. so very much evidence-based, as well as whole of economy modelling, and then ultimately clear policy pathways. And that will extend not just, of course, it has to be whole of economy or gases, but we're doing it on a sectoral basis to better articulate both the challenges, opportunities, and pathways.
Thank you, Kushla. Pass to you, Gerhard.
Yeah, thank you. We had a short chat before we started here. As Charon said, it would be great if we had another representative from government from a developing country, because we're talking about NDCs and investments, and we know that that's a quite different challenge for developing countries, but I think we will come to that later. But for that reason, I'd pick out perhaps a few very general things that I think can make NDCs credible. First of all, you have to understand we don't have a German NDC. The EU has an NDC, and our action is derived from the EU NDC, which is rooted in the target to be climate neutral by 2050, and we are now talking about our reduction goal for 2040. We have a change in the Commission right now, so the number of 90% is under discussion. We will see when the official decision will be taken on that. On that basis, we have a climate law, and that would be my first point. For a credible NDC, the best thing is to have your net zero target enshrined in a law, so that it cannot just be disappear with the next government. And I don't know if you will speak to that, but from my point of view, that's very important. So we have a law that says Germany is climate neutral in 2045. The second point, it's good to have a body that will follow up on what the government is doing. We have a climate council. I don't know how it's about Australia. A climate council that is independent and that will report once a year on the achievements of the government in the various sectors also. And the government is not obliged to change direction on the basis of that, but it has to reply to the in some way to the report of the independent council. I think that's an important thing. And the third one, perhaps Germany has very strong business associations and also workers associations, and I think for social license it's really crucial to have a debate with all these actors in your country when you formulate your NDC, to make it ambitious but also realistic. And on the financing question, I think we will come to that later, and that's also something that you have been writing about. Thank you.
Thank you to our country representatives. Now I want to just turn to our business groups and representatives. As representatives of businesses, what do you and what do some of the businesses you represent, how do they look at NDCs? How do they look at countries' national climate plans to assess the trajectory they will take? And how does that information help or affect their portfolio and investment decisions?
Sure, thank you. So firstly, it's great to hear this kind of very good practice hearing from Australia and Germany here, because these messages are very aligned with what business wants to be hearing. But before I get to the NDCs, let's just say, from a business perspective, obviously the context internationally is changing, and with what the changes we're about to see in the United States, businesses are really trying to get the message across that this transition is underway. It is unstoppable. The business case is so strongly there, as Chao referred to, that we don't expect to see that slow down because of significant changes in one player, however big that player is. It's a key message that business is bringing here because of that business case, and because business gets it now in terms of the risks involved, and that climate risk really is business risks, and this is a kind of materiality question for businesses. It's no longer something that's nice to do. It's really a core physical business risk that's hitting the bottom line in terms of damage to value chains, climate impacts throughout business operations. So that business is very much here and present. Turning to the question on the NDCs in particular, so we as We Mean Business Coalition put out a call to action on what business wants to see from NDCs to make them not only ambitious but also investable, because we're really all aware that whilst this transition is underway, we see this great ramping up of the amounts of investment going into the clean sectors, and we really need these NDCs to set the framework for that. Our approach to NDCs is then essentially set across 3 pillars. One is that, of course, the NDC itself has to be very clear that there is a long-term target, that it's economy-wide, that absolutely sets the direction of travel, but that it is also backed up in the NDC by sector-specific targets that are specific to things like achieving the goals of that were agreed last year in Dubai for tripling renewables, doubling efficiency, and so on, and very importantly for stating the plans and the policies and the pathway for transitioning away from fossil fuels. So we need to see within the NDC framework these sector-specific elements really clearly laid out. So that's the NDC itself. But our 3 pillars start with the NDC itself as number 1. Number 2 is then really being sure that those elements of the NDC are translated into the actual policy implementation. Because from a business investment perspective, it's very nice to have a strong target that sets the signal in the direction of travel and is, is a target recognized in the UNFCCC. But if it's not making it through to actual policy measures on the ground, the real, the tax credits, the incentives, the regulations that really drive business investment, then it's not going to be effective. So pillar 1, the NDC itself. Pillar 2, really translating into these policy frameworks with as much certainty and a long-term clarity as possible in order to get that investment flowing. And then the 3rd pillar is about the process of how all this is designed, so making sure that there's very strong stakeholder engagement from business, from other groups as well, not only in the design of the NDC, but also in how the policies are designed. We see quite a lot of scope for what we call co-creation of policy solutions between businesses and governments where, in a country that has a very ambitious target nationally, maybe several very big players influential in that country on the private sector side who also have their own very significant targets under the Science-Based Targets Initiative or otherwise. And the government and the private sector are both looking at the same problem, and there's plenty of crossover of understanding each other's constraints and opportunities to design these policies better together. So those are our kind of 3 pillars as we look at the NDCs. I just add very quickly, we did this call to action kind of globally. We're now taking it into much more country-specific actions to really make sure it counts and that businesses who are relevant in the major countries are being provided with policy messages that are relevant to that context. So working already with Brazil, we actually just started a great partnership with the German Federal Foreign Office to work with another number of other countries across the global south to get these business voices, the business voices that matter in that local context, to be speaking to the government about the local issues. So it's an exciting way forward for that work now. Thank you.
So we fully support the call to action, which we've contributed to, and the 3 pillars of it. I would add 2 additional elements that we think are very important, both as CDPQ, but in some of the other investor-led initiatives that I'm part of. A 4th additional element or pillar is the need to have a concrete plan or roadmap on how to develop the investability of the elements of the NDC. So this whole idea of upstream project preparation, it's really one of the key elements, because it's great to have plans. It's great to say we need to build X, Y, and Z to achieve goal A, B, and C. But if you don't have a concrete plan to actually move from vision to blueprints to getting shovels on the ground, there's going to be that missing piece. And then us as the private sector, we're not going to be able to go in and do what we do best, which is write large checks, especially if you're an institutional investor. So really having a concrete plan or strategy on how to do that upstream project preparation work. And as an aside, that's really an area where many of us from the private sector believe the multilateral development banks need to increase the amount of resources deployed to that. It's really a missing space in the current landscape. And then related to that, the 5th piece is the financing strategy. Let's say that you are able to develop these great plans and you have a good strategy on how to make them investable. What's the plan to finance them? And that's where what you mentioned about the dialogues is so important, because if particular gaps are identified, that's the right time for national authorities, or they could be subnational depending on the jurisdiction, or even municipal, should approach the private sector and say, okay, these are the financing gaps we've identified. Which of these, really fit into the profile of the kind of investments that you as a pension fund, or you as a bank, or you as a corporate can help finance? What are the additional sources of finance we need, and what other pools of additional finance are out there available that we can jointly access together, whether it's a multilateral development bank, a national development finance institution, a fund like the Green Climate Fund, or other sources. So those are just the 2 additional elements I would add to round out the 3 pillars of the call to action. maybe in 20 seconds, why is this important? Especially for institutional investors like pension funds. We much more than other sorts of deployers of capital, we like to deploy our capital for a long time. We don't like the churn. We don't like to do many transactions. We like to invest and hold for 5, 10, 15, 20 years or so. And that's why these NDCs are so important, because they give us the signals about what sectors are important, and so to enable us to start developing our plans, whether on a geographic or market segment basis for that long-term deployment of capital. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our speakers. And look, something that we have been touched on is that the first two questions focus a lot on how countries can use the next NDCs to accelerate action, economic growth in their own countries. But of course, part of our endeavor here is to support other countries, whether they're development partners or trade partners or otherwise. So the last question, which is directed to all our panelists, is how can countries and businesses benefit themselves as they decarbonize, but also at the same time be helping other countries to do so? I think this question is open to all four of our panelists, and that sort of covers things like helping middle income and developing countries to access and attract financing and investment in the context of rising sovereign debt and with a high cost of capital in some places. So I just want to open up, but I don't know who wants to go first. Gerhard, you had made some comments around this, so maybe I can invite you to go first, and then you can pass on to the next person.
Okay, let me start perhaps by saying what we've been discussing now all sounds fine and well. But when you're a developing country, when you're from Africa, how do you really make it happen? We are trying very hard to find solutions to this, and it really isn't easy. So it's a question that I have to CDPQ, for example. What does it take for you to invest in Africa? It cannot be just the NDCs. We know that it's about the cost of capital and how we bring it down, and what are actually the right tools. You mentioned the MDBs, and I think we are going into a phase where we don't think about what do commercial banks do and what do MDBs do, but how do we do things together? Yeah, but we can go much further on this. We have started an initiative. It's called the Green Guarantee Group, where we try to look at concretely at one. We know it's only one of the things in the toolbox, green guarantees. But then when you start looking into the details, it's really difficult. Yeah. So that would be a question for me. What does it take, apart from an NDC, to get the CAS really into places in Africa, for example? I served. My last posting was in Canada. I was posted in Ottawa. I spoke a lot with institutional investors, because they are among the largest in the world, and the barriers are simply there.
No, I'm happy to take that on. And by coincidence, my last posting was in Africa. I was the acting ambassador to South Sudan before I joined the private sector. So Africa has a special place in my heart too. So the short answer is, it is difficult. Like, I'm not going to lie and say, it's very easy to get pension funds, especially from countries like Canada or Australia, to invest in Africa. But it is possible. But first thing is, it's very rare for pension funds who aren't familiar with those markets already to go in by themselves in the first instance. They need to go with partners, and typically it's in some sort of multi-stakeholder partnership, often some sort of blended finance vehicle, right? So to give two examples that CDPQ has done, we've joined the Brookfield Catalytic Transition Fund, which was endowed with catalytic capital from Altera, which was launched by the UAE at COP28. And that one will go in a lot of markets, including Africa, or another one that's managed by a UK South African asset manager called 91. And that goes to your other question. That one is a private credit one, so that we're not increasing the indebtedness of the national governments, because I'm fully aware of the debt sustainability challenges. When I worked on the G20 file, like, that was always front and center. So to answer that question is not all of the financing has to be sovereign debt. There can be direct equity financing. There can be financing, debt at the subnational or municipal level. There can be private credit. So there are other tools in the toolkit that won't necessarily increase the debt burdens of national governments. But and again, to get to Africa or other difficult geographies for what pension funds like us from Europe, from Australia. Blended finance does 2 or 3 things, but one of them, it helps to slightly de-risk the investments to ensure that its risk-return profile is such that it reflects our own fiduciary obligations. But it also allows us to partner with players who do have long, extensive experience in those geographies. It's fear of the unknown, and that's not exclusive to the financial sector. I think that's a very natural human condition. And so partnering with somebody so you know that if something goes wrong, you have that 911 number that you can call who knows what's going on. And to help with the pipeline of projects, which was another problem that I mentioned in the first instance.
Yeah, thank you. So from the We Mean business side, so we mostly are representing the so-called real economy, the non-financial businesses, major corporations, manufacturing, energy, transport, and so on. So we work less on finance, but what I would say in the context of this question and this process is very much this de-risking element. So whilst we have this strong message around the core of this, if attracting investments in value chains, big corporates, in multinationals, wherever they're based, looking to expand value chains into the global south, well, the policy framework does matter, the NDC does matter, and that follow through into policy. But of course, what the role of the public climate finance, the north to south finance, which is get thrashed out in this process here, is so important for helping to de-risk those investments, to bring down the cost of capital, to make this global investment from the private sector more globally equitable. Because it's a well-known fact now. The IEA report on clean energy growth, the investment growth is changing so fast. Massive growth year on year. Clean energy investment globally, 85% of that is still going to essentially the global north and China, so the OECD countries plus China, and that 15% only is going to the rest of the world. So our message here is, whilst we care a lot and businesses are calling for this structure and this clarity in the NDCs, as I was talking about before, they're also very much calling for this strong outcome on the north to south climate finance to help facilitate more private sector investment in the global south, and that's not been a strong message from the private sector before. I could go on to talk a bit about kind of policy measures in generally in countries, if that was part of the question, or should we turn to the government? Just to say from a corporate perspective, we talked a lot about the actual going from the NDC through to the policy framework and really getting the incentives and the regulations right. But when we look at the corporate landscape, a lot of the action so far is essentially voluntary, and we see these leaders in the corporate space stepping up, setting their own science-based targets, engaging with their suppliers, it's so-called scope 3 emissions, so they're committing not only to their own operational emissions, but also the whole value chain, upstream and downstream. And to do that, they have to engage with their suppliers. And there's some really inspiring examples of corporate leadership in that area. But to go further, it has to go on a journey towards regulatory approaches, and we can't solve this problem with only expecting the leaders to lead. So we tried to approach encouraging, we need to be celebrating those corporate leaders and making it easy to them to lead and to push the envelope and getting them to speak up in front of governments. We do need to be bringing up the floor. So the regulatory approaches, both in terms of the kind of corporate governance, enforcing disclosure on companies, enforcing transition plans, but also, of course, the actual incentive measures and the regulations in terms of mandates, in terms of actually how the concrete investments are incentivized. So we had that kind of dual approach of celebrating the leaders voluntarily, but pushing towards this voluntary nature. Mandatory nature.
Thank you. And if I can maybe just round out some really great insights already from the panel, take it a little bit more back to, say, Australia's perspective of what does kind of good look like when you're bringing business and you're also working and influencing, hopefully, what other countries are going to do. So again, it does draw from really significant policy developments in Australia. So the future made in Australia sort of feels like it's a version that we're just trying to do all these things, but it's absolutely the net zero transformation stream of future made in Australia is about Australia looking out. So it's about the comparative advantages of this incredible renewable energy resources. And what does that mean in terms of how you can use that and do more in your own country, say on green iron? One of the really special relationships we actually have with Germany is, we're looking at supply chains in terms of what would you do in your respective countries to potentially shift and change where some of that energy is used, value added, but also very aware of the importance of sort of German steel making and all of the industries related to that. So it gets sort of more complicated because you're thinking about your own country, but your country in terms of net zero sort of trading relationships and where and how will they shift and change. And so, of course, the next round of NDCs, like we're saying, incredibly important, ambitious and credible. But I do think, particularly with the major economies and others, there is this fundamental need to appreciate how we will have to work together. And of course, the regulatory, the policy and the financing all coming together.
Okay, well, thank you to our panelists. We're going to open up now for questions, comments from the audience. And I'll pass to our delegate in the back in a moment. But just to make the comment that this idea, this connection between economic opportunity and NDCs, that's been around since the very beginning. But really now it's taking off in such a way that people have not been able to foresee. And I think even though it's been around for a long time, making that connection beyond the narrative level, but then, okay, well, what are the things that we can do to send the right signals? How can we attract investment? And then from a business perspective, what can we find in the NDCs that really help? That connection is still being made as far as we're seeing. So conversation like this and the questions that we all have are very much relevant and very much part of the conversation in a moment. But with that, I'll open up. I've got someone in the back. If you wouldn't mind just stating your name, but also who you represent.
Thank you very much. My name is Ayine Richard Simon Nigo. I'm from the University of Westminster, and I'm here as an observer with the Center for Green Economy based in South Africa. Now, I want to make a brief comment in regards to the issue to do with the NDC and Africa, or a developing country in that case. Now, just before I attended the Australian pavilion, I was seated in the IGAD, which is Intergovernmental Organization for Development. It's a regional body that encompasses around 7 African countries, mainly in the center. I'm sure Eric will be very familiar with during those days when you were here. Now, the central focus of those regional bodies and the countries was something to do with AA, which is anticipatory actions. So they were looking at mitigating climate eventualities or mitigating them before they happen. So that is their model of thinking. But I saw that the model that they are looking at has a little bit of a gap in terms of the connections between the IGAD itself and the countries that they are representing, because IGAD was there as an institution and none of what they are advocating was within the national priorities of the government. So therefore, my question therefore is, if IGAD represented countries is looking at AA, how can the developed countries, especially say Germany or Australia, in their financing model, avoid such kind of what we call overlapping loop, where you have IGAD in a way looking for something that they want to implement, but it's not in the national priority. How can therefore funding be misplaced in such kind of scenario? Thank you.
Thank you for that. We might just take a few more comments or questions, and then I'll turn over to the panel to respond to them.
Hi, my name is Mao Emis. I'm from the African Center for Green Economy based in South Africa. Mine is really a very straight question. What can to do the global financial architecture, how can the cost of capital to developing countries be reduced? Very practical examples of how, countries in the global south can get capital at a reduced cost.
Thank you.
Yeah, for Fiona Ryan from Forest Development and Climate. I was just talking about guarantees. There's MEGA from the World Bank, and I know Australia gave a presentation on its bilateral subsidisation of, bilateral sort of risk modifying or whatever you call it works. I forget the name. It was only a couple of days ago. I forget the name of the program, but yeah. So the government takes first loss or takes equity and things like that. The developed country government does. How have you thought about how they affect business? I mean, obviously they're trying to get private investment in there. So what do you think of those, and what's the problem with them? What problems you might have with them? Well, bilateral aid organisations do try to facilitate private investment in developing countries. Australia is one of them. Through guarantees of loans, taking first loss positions of loans, putting them in a first loss, things like that. How do you feel that they're going to work? Obviously, they're going to tip up in climate finance. They're going to take a big. They're going to be a big part of climate finance if we believe what we hear. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, I think we have one more question and then we'll go to the speakers.
Hello, my name's Sam. I'm from Curtin University in West Australia. I was actually just going to ask Kushla if there's any light that you could glean on what our NDCs are looking like as we move into Brazil, and if there's anything you could share on those. Thank you.
Okay, we might turn back to our panel, and just to say, I think there's quite a diverse number of questions reconciling national priorities with regional priorities in terms of bilateral investments, cost of capital, intersectionality between some of those bilateral loans and investments, and then of course a great question, a relevant one on what are NDCs looking like. It's a bit of a crystal ball, but I think there'll be lots of discussions going on. So I don't know who would like to go first.
Sure. I'm gonna start with the cost of capital question, because that's a really great question. And if you want a more detailed answer, I would encourage everyone to look at a report that CDPQ was proud to help prepare with actually another great Australian, John Denton, the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. It's the B20 Task Force on Finance and Infrastructure, which we presented to the government of Brazil in their capacity as G20 president at Climate Week in New York. Now, within that, I'll draw two main ways forward to try and lower the cost of capital in emerging markets, including in Africa. One is through better data and then the use of that data. So what do I mean by that? Mostly the interest rates, the cost of capital is determined by the national interest rate, okay. And then there's a risk premium, a liquidity premium, and so on. So the risk premium piece is the main piece, right? That causes the differential between the cost of capital in an emerging market and in an advanced economy. Why is data important? Because there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that shows that investments in emerging markets, including in Africa, actually have much better default or recovery rates than would commonly be expected, but yet that good performance isn't priced into the risk premium. And one of the main reasons for that is that there's just not a lot of data publicly available. Traditionally, a lot of it has been housed in the multilateral development banks who had not released it publicly. Now they're starting to. It's in a database called the GEMS database. They're starting to release that publicly, and now there's efforts underway to analyze it more thoroughly and try and then use that information to create a better framework for the credit rating agencies to then properly assess based on actual and historic risk performance and not perceived risk. So that's a big piece. The other piece on the cost of capital relates to the prudential regulatory environment as determined by things like Basel III, Solvency II, etc. A lot of these institutions, in an effort to create global financial stability, have sort of created artificial or arbitrary distinctions between advanced and developing advanced economies, and require higher capital risk weightings and a whole suite of technical issues. And a lot of those, again, aren't based on actual historic performance, or based more on perceived risk and a lack of data. So if we were, going to try and tackle this in a serious way, we need all available data to be made public. It can be anonymized if necessary, so that these studies can be made, and it'd be very good for the G20 countries to really take a lead on addressing the global macroprudential regulatory framework and ensure that it stops impeding the flow of capital to emerging markets.
Certainly support all of that. As I said before, the financing is not the area we've worked on particularly as a coalition, but what I would just add in the question of the risk premium and how can we address that in the context of this transition towards net zero in global south countries, where I think it's quite recognized now that for all the efforts in the past to facilitate climate finance, there's been quite a focus on the specifics of the green sectors and developing a project pipeline to grow clean energy efficiency, whatever it is, in particular countries that have higher cost of capital, higher risk premiums, and haven't seen that so far. But there's increasing recognition now, I think, that the climate finance has to be applied also to more general factors influencing the risk premium. So country political risk factors and dealing with currency exchange, things as basic as that, making sure that there's facilities to help hedge those exchange risks, and just sort of broadening out that picture. It's the green pipeline matters, but the broader factors, the country risk, are also an important element to that. Maybe on the guarantees question, pass maybe to Gerhard. I know you're working on the green guarantees program. So.
Yeah, thank you. Eric and Andrew are much more qualified than me to answer this question. I'm a historian, but I'm digging into this, so I think, but there are two. I would say, when we talk about the de-risking, I see three levels. One is what developed countries can do. One is what developing countries can do themselves, and then the middle part, which is about the perceived risk that you just mentioned, and that. And we have looked at these questions also in the Green Guarantee Group, and that's one of the issues we think we need to address: how to have more transparent data and data sharing. Data sharing among MDBs, and also between MDBs and national development banks and regional development banks. And for what countries can do themselves, we are here in a negotiating that is very polarized, and where we talk about NDCs and what kind of money will developed countries give so that NDCs can be implemented. But here we are discussing how NDCs can also draw in private capital, right? So I understand that it's a difficult debate in the negotiating room, but when you go to any other fora, it's well understood that if the regulatory situation isn't good, the money is not going to flow. So that is one part of the equation. But then you also have to come to the practical de-risking things. What can we do? We think it's important to find more solutions to work with local currency. And to work closer with the African Development Bank. If you talk about Africa, for example, we have a number of innovative programs that Germany has funded with seed capital. There is a project preparation facility, for example, that helps create projects for the pipeline that then will be investable. There is an alliance for green infrastructure. Then there's also reducing some of the risk with insurance, disaster risk insurance and climate risk insurance, because the assets that you're investing in also have to be climate resilient somehow. So there's a whole toolbox, but roughly I would say these are the three levels that you have to address somehow. For the international financial architecture as a whole, it's not easy. Everyone knows that. But we think it would be great, and we hope that we get some language on that in the COP decision. We need to find ways to link what is inside the UNFCCC and what's outside the UNFCCC, and there is not much consensus, but there is good language in the Pact for the Future, that was adopted in New York. There is a tasking to the MDBs to present recommendations in consultation with the Secretary General on improving the international financial system. I think we can build on that. There is a tasking for the MDBs to increase callable capital. There is a whole number of discussions that I think have a potential to increase the finance that will be available. You have perhaps followed the announcement that the MDBs made last week on Tuesday, that they think they can raise 120 billion climate finance provided to developing countries by 2030, but also they said that they think that they can mobilize another 65 billions. Mobilize mean that with the money that the banks have, they can bring in additional capital, and that ratio right now is 25 cents per dollar. And with the ambition they have presented, they are saying they think that until 2030 they can bring this to 50 cents per dollar, which would be a good achievement. Thank you.
I think excellent answers, particularly on the questions about what that's going to look like for the international financing. Maybe just addressing a question from our friend from the Curtin University. So only 2 countries have so far actually submitted their NDCs, so that's the United Arab Emirates and Brazil. There was a big announcement from the Prime Minister of the UK. It was the target, not in fact the nationally determined contribution. And so I think that will develop, obviously all countries have to put forward their NDCs next year. There's a question of what that time will start to look like. But I guess the fundamentals in terms of what this, the expectations that are on the NDC to genuinely be able to, direct guide the work that has to happen in your own country. But these investment signals that we're sort of hearing are just so important. So it is going to be about the quality, I think, of the supporting policy planning, the engagement that has happened to fundamentally have that credibility. So don't know yet exactly what that's going to look like, but that's what we're about. That's what we're also pushing as part of those coalitions.
Thank you to our panelists. Now, we've probably got time for 1 or 2 more questions. I just want to throw, and I'll pass that around for that, but I just want to throw into this mix. We've talked a lot about some of the principles behind it, but I wouldn't mind asking our panelists to provide just one specific example of a signal that you would like to send through your policies in terms of attracting investment, or from the business groups, one signal that you're really, really looking for, and a specific example, just to help us crystallize and understand a little bit some of these principles that we're talking about. But before that, I might just open up, because I think there's a few more questions, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you very much. Nikki Hutley, representing the Climate Council. Hello, Krishna. A question in reflecting 2 different views from government and the private sector. We're talking a lot at COP about how far we're going on renewable energy, and that's wonderful. There's a bit of an elephant in the room on fossil fuels, though. And so the question then becomes, from both an investment and a government policy point of view, how quickly can we move to transition? So from an investment point of view, what do you look for? Are you looking for pure green? Eric, you mentioned, we've got all these green assets. Are you looking for pure green assets? Because we obviously need to somehow support those that are transitioning. How do we manage that? And I guess from a policy perspective as well, given the economic contribution, especially in Australia, from that sector, how do we balance that in what rolls out through NDCs? And maybe that's a bit hard to answer in this room, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. Thank you.
Okay. Any final takers for questions before we go back to the panel? No. Okay. Kushla, can I invite you to go first this time?
Well, maybe building, and maybe not directly addressing your question, but going to your point, Chow, if there was one message that I would really want, the community, businesses, and certainly the investment sector to take away from Australia's NDC is that Australia is serious about its transition, which does go to the point of what our major exports have been in the past, but looking to the next 25 years, what we have to do to the future. And so it is about the credibility, the understanding, the policy, the investment that is going to take. So it is about how credible and investable, Australia is as a country.
Who would like to go next?
That's a great question that you asked. And it's a dilemma that a lot of us asset owners who have net zero commitments face. Because ultimately, we need to deploy the capital where the emissions are, or else we're just going to have accounting decarbonization, which isn't helpful at all. So in the case of CDPQ, one way around that, what we've done is we've created a dedicated $10 billion sleeve or carve-out exclusively for investing in high emissions sectors, and we exclude those emissions from our overall portfolio emissions accounting, okay? But to qualify for that we have like a series of robust criteria that will make an investment in that sector eligible. And so far we've deployed about half of it, $5 billion, and the results have been quite good. The example I usually like talking about, and we presented it in New York a few weeks ago, is we invested in a major power utility in Indiana, in the United States. And Indiana, for those of you who know the United States, is not usually thought of as a pioneer towards achieving net zero. But nonetheless, we invested in the largest utility that provides power to greater Indianapolis. It was all coal. Now almost all of its coal is retired. And we're on track to reduce emissions by, if I remember correctly, it's 75%, I think, by 2030, and net zero in all its electricity generation by 2040. So that's an example, and it's really critical because, as I said at the onset, we have to deploy the capital where the emissions are, but on the same time, if we do it under our existing accounting structures, we'll get, we'll be called out for being in violation of our net zero commitment. So it's trying to navigate those two things. It's not easy. If I have 10 seconds left, I just want to also thank the German government for the Hamburg Sustainability Platform. So CDPQ is very proud to be one of the private sector co-signers along with Allianz. And what's that trying to do is that it's trying to standardize blended finance. So you talked about first loss and guarantees. These are all really critically important mechanisms, but right now they're not standardized. They tend to be very bespoke. It's like redesigning the wheel every single time. And so the idea is, okay, we have about 20 or 30 different wheels now. Let's not redesign any new ones. Let's just use those wheels in the right context. And so I think that's a really great initiative, and we're really happy to be part of it.
Andrew, do you want to go?
Thank you, and just to complement with a different perspective on this very important question on the fossil fuels, which is ever present in this process that we're all part of here, and so important. So the way we've been trying to address this from the kind of demand side, real economy, corporates perspective is we built a campaign last year before the Dubai COP, really showing that there is a demand signal from businesses that they want to be phasing out from fossil fuels in their own operations, be they manufacturing corporates, transport companies, power utilities, but that to achieve that, they really need to be working on the policy signals from the international process and then from the direct policies and plans within government. So we built this campaign called Fossil to Clean, which is a little badge I have on now, and just really trying to push for that language in this process to show that there is this strong direction of travel on fossil fuels. And we continue to work on this campaign right now in this process, in the G20, just defending all the time that this international signal has to still be there. There are plenty of countries out there trying to remove it, water it down, but we really need to build on that because it is it's quite distant from direct business operations, but it really matters that these signals are maintained and the pressure is kept on countries to enforce that and to then be expected to be acting on it. So that's how we try and bring this voice of companies who are not necessarily involved in fossil fuel production conversion directly, but which are keen to make sure that their voice counts in the policy space. And that brings me to Chao's question on the what's the actual signal that companies want to see. I think overall, leading business really wants to see that it's the basket of economic incentives that it's faced are shifting towards the drive towards investments in the clean economy, to use shorthand, at the disadvantage of companies who are not acting. So that, that overall basket. But if I had to pick out one thing within that, it comes back to the balance of subsidies, addressing the fossil fuel subsidies that still exist for production, for consumption, and having, we're trying to get businesses to come clean. How are they, so to speak, that's a bit of a pun unintended, but to businesses to speak up for, how are they actually benefiting from subsidies, and how would they like to see them repurposed to help level that playing field. So there's, coming back, we often hear about it, but it's so important. Getting the subsidies right, the balance between fossil and clean remains ever important as part of that signal.
Gerhard, you can have the last word.
Thank you. So first, I didn't want to avoid the question on the export guarantees. I forgot to answer that. Germany has been doing export guarantees for over 50 years. We are an export nation, and we have helped German companies de-risk their investments abroad, and we will continue to do so. And it's important, in line with the Paris Agreement, to make all these flows consistent with the goal of becoming net zero. So I don't think that there is anything wrong with green export guarantees. We have introduced a kind of three-tier system where we say what is climate negative, we don't give guarantees anymore. We have investments that are climate neutral. They are treated as before, and then we have climate positive investments that get a better treatment. And this is has already brought down considerably anything that is close to fossil fuels. Of course, then you have questions that are debatable. If you invest into a refurbishment of a power station, for example, but roughly that's a story on export guarantees, and they have been usually successful and actually not expensive for the government, which we think is why we think guarantees can be a really inexpensive tool to drive much more investment in developing countries. And that takes me to my last remark, perhaps. The overall, what I would like to see, we talked about NDCs, but the overall signal that comes from a place like this, from COP29, is that this transition is happening. It will not be turned back. The money is there. Yeah, there are 250, according to the London Stock Exchange, there are 250 trillion capital available. 180 trillion is equity. Yeah, so when we talk about making happen investment flows into developing countries in the range of 1 or 1.5 trillion, it's possible. Yeah, it can be done. We need to increase green investments overall, and then we have to make sure that of that investment more goes to developing countries, because now 90% go to developed countries and China, and only 10% to developing countries. Thank you.
I didn't answer your question, so I apologize. I wanted to do it. I think if the signal that we would like to see out of this COP, and you'll appreciate this because I know you worked on the SDGs like I did, is that the NCQG and the whole financing discussion should capture the spirit of SDG 17, right? And what do I mean by that? It needs to recognize that it should be a revitalization of the global partnership for sustainable development and climate action, drawing from resources from all sources, public, private, domestic, international. That's how we're going to do it. So that would be my call for the NCQG.
Well, I think that we will wrap over there, and there's some great comments there to end on. The transition is happening, the money is there. Of course, it's a much harder problem of translating that to make sure that it's done well, that it's in a just transition, a community is looked after, but there is certainly a very, very different global landscape at this time when there's NDCs compared to 5 years ago. So just to close on that note, I just want to, if we could just join in thanking our panelists, and thank you for joining us over here today. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.